Welcome, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders. And I want to welcome you to the first program of 2021. 2020 is in hindsight now, so we're happy to be in the new year. And we're going to start with a great program, How Can Philanthropy Invest in a More Equitable Technology Sector? We've got a great program, great speakers. And this is the second program in a three-part series. Our moderator for this series is Alafia Zoyab, who is the Advocacy Director of Reset. And today we're going to be hearing from Eli Pariser, who's co-director of Civic Signals and formerly head of Upworthy, founder of Upworthy. And many of you may know him as the author of The Filter Bubble and a lifetime ago, executive director, I think, of Move On, early political organizing. Kamal Sinclair is back with us. She's executive director of the Guild of Future Architects. And previously, we've encountered her in her work at the Sundance New Frontiers part of the festival. And also new to our presentations, Michelle Ferguson, who is National Community Initiatives Director of Dreamcore Tech. And Michelle is normally based in Atlanta, so we know we're reminded of the moment we're in. We're all in. It's a kind of a day of urgency and optimism and opportunity. And we know that social change doesn't happen overnight, even though some of us may have waited until the wee hours of the morning to watch the election returns come in. We know that the kind of social change we're going to be talking about today takes years to plan and organize. And I just want to point out that this conversation builds on previous conversations we've had with some of these presenters and organizations. Kamal and Eli were with us in our 2018 Media Impact Forum, talking about the building blocks of what they're doing now. And it's really great to see that those ideas mature and take root and take shape. As well, Michelle's going to be talking to us about the kind of pipeline work that they're doing at Dreamcore Tech. We heard about this first over 5 years ago when the founder of Dreamcore, Van Jones, joined us in Silicon Valley at our Media Impact Forum of 2015 to talk about the early ideas of Yes We Code. And we'll give you links to all those talks too, so you can see the roots and the building blocks of what we're going to be talking about today. But I'm going to get out of the way now and let Alafia lead this really interesting discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vince. Before we dive in, I'll just say a few words about Reset, where I'm the advocacy director. Reset was set up last year, and our vision is to reset the connection between media and democracy so that we as citizens can be better informed and less divided. We seek to neutralize the threats posed to democracy and social cohesion with the rampant spread of disinformation, hate speech, and polarization that have been massively enabled by today's digital media monopolies. Reset is a hybrid global organization, and we're engaged in programmatic work ourselves. But we're also an agile philanthropy that enables existing organizations and ecosystems to test new ideas to catalyze change. Before we enter into a discussion with this excellent panel, I'm going to ask each panelist to give us a short introduction to the work that they're doing, as well as their opening comments on how philanthropy can enable and invest in a more equitable tech sector. So Michelle, let me start with you.
Thank you, Alafia, and thank you everyone on the panel. I'm so glad to be here. So exciting, and I love talking about this work. I am Michelle Ferguson, National Community Initiative Director for Dreamcore Tech. As Vince did mention, we were started off as Yes We Code back in 2014, and we transitioned to to Dreamcore Tech about 3 years ago. Our sole mission is to cultivate future leaders and entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds to really diversify the pipeline in tech and then shift it in a more equitable manner. So what we do to do that is we train and hire talent within local communities who usually don't have a tech background. We partner with organizations such as Target, Optum, United Healthcare, Infor to train for specific roles they have in their organizations. For 8 to 10 weeks, we train our talent. The boot camp is free to them. At the end of the training, they are guaranteed a placement, whether it is an apprenticeship or a job placement, which is a full-time FTE. We provide scholarships to tech professionals who want to get a certification or individuals going through a 4-year degree program, just to help mitigate any financial barriers. We also dabble in tech policy. We are really big on broadband access. That's one of our main charges. I'm bringing broadband access to not only urban communities, but also rural communities as well. They tend to be left out of that conversation, as well as Native American populations as well. Ethics and privacy issues, coding and algorithm bias, and tech diversity, which is what we do with our coding bootcamp program. And just to answer the question, how philanthropy can touch these areas or make the tech space more equitable is really donating or programs that provide infrastructure where there is not, so people can have access, and not just internet, but quality internet, because a lot of people have internet, but if you have 5 individuals on one system and it's not even at working speed or what the minimum speed should be, then it's kind of like they don't have internet at all. And then really funding programs who do the work of training individuals to enter into the sector, or providing them placements to get into jobs, and not even just help desk jobs, but getting them software engineering jobs. Really where we see a lot of the issues are become the algorithm bias. You have to have coders who represent the full community to really kind of combat what we see, especially with digital redlining. So that's just my input there on how philanthropy can help. And thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for those opening comments, and lots more to discuss, but over to you, Eli.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Eli Pariser. I'm co-director at Civic Signals. I have to thank both you, Roshni, and Vince for the opportunity to be at that forum and meet Kamal, which is actually where we started collaborating. And now I'm a guild member, which you'll hear about, and Kamal's been an incredibly important advisor for us. So our focus, if what Michelle talked about is kind of who's building the next digital ecosystems, and I think that's such a critical question. The other piece of that is like, well, what do we need to build? And obviously those questions are interrelated, because the communities that are building have their own ideas about what's needed. So our project at Civic Signals has been to kind of think about what's the nature of the kind of digital ecosystems that we need in order to weave a healthier social fabric and create inclusive and equitable digital spaces. And our approach to thinking about this has been to key off physical public spaces and physical public institutions, and think about how we can use that to inform what might be needed digitally. And I think one big takeaway from that is that our conversation around a better tech environment often centers the giants, Google and Facebook and Twitter. And I think our view is, alongside these private companies, we really need a much more robust public digital infrastructure that can help support a thriving digital life. It's just hard to see how we get there otherwise. The last thing I'll just say is next week, with Kamal and many others, we're kicking off the new public festival, and would love to share an invitation to that with everyone here starting January 12th, and I'll put a link in the chat, but excited to talk more.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eli. And Kamal, over to you next.
I'm just honored to be on the call with both of you. You're doing a phenomenal work. I'm, as Eli and Vince had shared, I'm the executive director of the Guild of Future Architects, which is an organization about almost 2 years old that was really stimulated by some research that I was resourced to do by the Ford Foundation back in 2016, 2017, called Making a New Reality, that has continued to evolve. And the goal of that research was to really look at, in emerging media spaces, industries, forms, craft, how do we make interventions early on so that equality and equity are grounded and kind of part of the value system of those media, emerging mediums. And so, one of the key things that came out of, over 100 interviews and over 1,000 articles reviewed was that we are in a critical time that we are in a crisis of imagination. We're seeing a lot of the same pitfalls from previous media cycles where things were kind of had opportunity to be open, had an opportunity to be inclusive, that different agendas took over. And we, even within, you know, kind of the great digital age of the 90s, of where the internet was supposed to be a free and democratized space. And so looking at how do we intervene now with technologies that are more exponential than we've ever seen in human history, and therefore more critical in terms of their power and our responsibility to wield them correctly. One of the key ahas from that research was we have to democratize the imagination of our future, because if we continue to design systems with these exponential powers that are not inclusive, we will see faulty designs that are just not going to optimize anybody's agendas. Plus, they're going to create inequities and continue to kind of deepen the legacy inequities. And so I think, you know, the toolkit really focuses on, you know, what are these emerging mediums? What is the power that they have, the exponential power that they have? What is the responsibility we have to bend technology to justice instead of allowing it to replicate injustice? And really looking at in detail some of those kind of key challenges that we're seeing surface in these mediums, but then looking at what are those interventions on a broad, you know, looking at personal change, institutional change, and systems change. And I think, you know, also really building off of some incredible work done around design principles that we can adopt as we think about designing these new systems in terms of design justice, universal design, design for well-being, looking at co-creation. We were very much influenced by the co-creation studios at MIT and their collective wisdom report. And then of course, design prosperity. And as Eli has kind of indicated, me personally take my inspiration from people like Jane Jacobs, who decided to speak truth to power at different innovation design phases of our within history, and saying, no, we're going to hold space for different value systems. And that's the end of my intro.
Thank you all so much, and I really appreciate you keeping to time on your opening comments. I feel like the thing I sensed in the three opening comments were, we need to obviously do something about the digital public square as it exists today, but also not fall into the trap of this crisis of imagination in how we, you know, meet the future and design the future. If I can start with the crisis of today, and since there are so many philanthropists on the call, in your view, what are some of the theories of change? What are some of the initiatives in play at the moment that are having the most impact in changing the system from within? So, for example, you know, with Michelle working on the very foundational issue of who even works at these tech organizations, you know, they're focused on that. But can the panel, can you guys talk us through some of those initiatives? Maybe I can start with Michelle and then come back to you, Eli and Kamal.
Yeah, so one of the initiatives and that a lot of organizations that we do see have is they are focusing on recruitment. So they're recruiting from these underrepresented communities, whether that's Black, Latinx, women, even those that are formerly incarcerated, because they would initially help with facial recognition technology because they are the key people who've been targeted by such technology. So they help provide insight. But it's also important to note that we have to focus also on retention. So whether we're putting people in these positions or these jobs to try to help combat the bias that we see right now in a lot of our technology, if we're not making space for them to thrive there and be comfortable and feel belonging, they're going to leave. We're going to be back at that same issue that we are right now. And we're actually seeing that. There was an increase in diversity in tech about 2 years ago. You saw to see a decline. People are coming in just as fast as they're leaving. So we have to create a space for people to come in knowing that their thoughts, their perspectives are going to be valued here, and that we need them to have that diversity of thought to create better things that we want to see in the future. So I think it's important for us to focus also on retention, not just on recruitment.
Eli?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add to that. It's part of why I think what's happening at Google right now is so critical, because if folks haven't followed, there was a prominent Black AI ethicist who was fired for very spurious reasons. And now you're seeing a whole bunch of folks unionizing to reclaim some worker power. I think all of that is trying to reset the dynamics where, it's not enough just to have inclusion if you don't have equity and you don't have representation at the executive level. And so I think that's a really important struggle that's happening, and I think we can expect it to get much more heated this is not going to be an easy shift, I think, because it really comes down to some very big questions about who holds power in these extraordinarily powerful companies. But I think that's certainly one locus that I'm feeling very inspired by at the moment.
And Kamal, like, what are some of the initiatives? So there's the change happening within these companies. There's constant civil society pressure on the platforms to change their policies. There's also regulation globally, particularly in Europe. So what gives you hope that some of the existing theories of change to make that change happen from within? What are some of the most exciting initiatives?
Well, I have to say that just in my own experience being in the space from, over the last 15 years, I remember, when I was at Sundance and we were seeing the kind of beginning of the hype cycle around virtual reality, there was, I saw with my own eyes how this kind of, the ways in which power and resources were retained within certain demographics, even though we had a wide variety of makers and engineers and technologists and creatives that were coming from all different backgrounds. Still, at the end of the day, we found that those that got invested at $1 million to $20 million were cisgendered, able-bodied white men. Even though it wasn't a lack of pipeline, it wasn't a lack of merit. That meritocracy argument was pretty much debunked from my own personal kind of front row seat to watching the process. And so I think that at the time I felt in many ways very powerless and very alone, but trying to raise the alarms around what I was seeing as a woman of color that was one of the few women of color in the rooms that I was in around these Silicon Valley and technologist and venture capitalist environments. But I have to say that since that time, 2015, I have seen people like Michelle, people that have really risen to stake a claim that we are not going to allow those cycles to repeat. And I noticed it particularly among women in VR at that time, that they said, we're not going to cede the space like we did in the 80s when women dropped out of tech. And so even though it is, and I've also seen people that have showed up and not had the ability to be resilient in those spaces because they are harsh microaggression, not major aggressive spaces. But I think what I was more encouraged by was finding people like Joy Waluimi and those that are finding each other to maintain space and not get intimidated out of those spaces. We obviously, as Michelle said, have a long way to go in that respect, but I think that we are in a stronger position than we ever have before of allowing ourselves to educate each other, to understand the high stakes that are at play, especially around artificial intelligence and bioengineering. And I do have, from the communities that I've been able to be a part of over these last 5 years, I think that there's more of a resilience to hold that line than there has been in the past.
And I mean, certainly the movement's done an incredible job of educating people that technology is not immune to human bias. Like, that just seems like a basic thing that we only just seem to have started to understand. I want to ask an uncomfortable question, which is, if you peel back further, even if there was a strong pipeline of candidates from very diverse backgrounds, do we have a fundamental problem with the business model? Because this business model was not built on the first principles of equity, diversity. So is that where we come to the next thing, which is maybe we just need something completely new and different? And is that something that philanthropists need to be thinking about, which is a dual role, which is fight the fires for now, but we do actually need something different? Maybe Kamal, I'll start with you again.
Absolutely. So at the Guild of Future Architects, this is a community of practice that is trying to stimulate and catalyze bold imagination of the future by, really doing a best we can to curate and diversity of thought. So we're thinking of those systems in complex ways. And, we over the last year, we did 648 hours of futurist writers' rooms with diverse groups, looking at everything from food systems to the future of capitalism. And I think one of the things that keeps coming back around is that, especially with artificial intelligence, the old system of rugged individualistic capitalism and even free market, is really going to have to be reimagined, because when you have statistics like 79% of the current work is going to be outmoded by artificial intelligence. That is a huge disruption in a very short timeline, and I think that the way in which resources are managed and distributed, and who has access and who has power, can go two very different ways right now. When you have the head of Microsoft say there's enough with this technology, we have the potential to feed, house, educate, and give healthcare to every individual on the planet, knowing that our work, we could even do it on less work hours. There's an abundance in that system. But right now we're not seeing that. We're seeing a complete consolidation of power. We're seeing it still serving, shareholder interests over all others. And I think that even some of the big companies are identifying that is not something that continue in this kind of extractive exponential growth. We have to consider regenerative systems.
Eli, to you next. I mean, even with
Yeah.
the best of intentions, can the existing system fundamentally change?
Yeah, no. And there's sort of like, I think, it depends on how disingenuous or malicious you feel like various platforms are. But even if we take the most generous view, I think there's just this reality that, like, we're asking institutions that were not built to do any of this stuff to hold these critical public functions. Of course they're going to fail. Like, it's the wrong shape of thing to solve this problem, and indeed it never has in the history of humanity. So there's a way in which this is a setup for everyone, including even, if you want to be generous, big tech, like that we were stuck in this paradigm where we're expecting these companies to do a job that they're poorly suited for. And so to me, that's why we have to stop, sort of like, and forgive the partisan, analogy, but it's like, you never solve the Trump problem by talking about Trump. I don't think you solve the Facebook and Twitter problem by talking about Facebook and Twitter, because it's a fundamentally reactive mindset. And what we need to do is think about, well, what is the public sphere that we need, and what are the social functions that we need? And then how do we create the set of resources and institutions that are actually gonna instantiate that? And I really feel like that's kind of the next big step, so that, and again, I sort of feel like it's not a radical idea. It's actually the only way it's ever worked, is that we've had some nonprofit institutions or not profit-seeking institutions and some businesses in a community together to meet community needs. Like, that's the only model that has worked in the history of human communities.
To actually follow up on that, in some ways we're in such a crisis of democracy right now that we need to be sending the fire trucks ASAP. And Europe is thinking very strongly about regulation. The Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, hopefully in the next 3-4 years will be passed. So in terms of regulation and public policy, applying public policy to rein in the tech giants, like, is that a serious proposition that American philanthropy should be getting behind, like taking a much more global outlook?
Oh, 100%. And the thing is that these two things are so intrinsically linked. So just to give a very concrete example, Facebook has a unit inside Facebook. I won't diverge too far, but they bought an app that pays teenagers to install this app on their phone, and the app sends Facebook all of the traffic on the phone in exchange for like $50 a month. And the purpose of this app is to see what new things teens are doing that might be a threat to Facebook's attention economy. and then either buy those companies where they're still small, or replicate those functions, right? As long as you have this kind of extraordinary competitive advantage, it's going to be incredibly difficult to build public sector products that offer alternatives, right? So we really need, on the one hand, there's just no reason that, I mean, that's fundamentally anti-free market behavior. There's no reason that we should permit, that kind of monopolistic behavior on the one hand. On the other hand, it creates spaces and kind of cracks in the wall where you can start to see new alternatives develop, and where you can start to see people. I can't tell you how many people I talk to who are like, I'd like to get into this space, but it's hopeless because they're too strong. And so we would need to, at the same time, kind of lessen that power hold and start envisioning, well, what do we actually want to be filling those, those gaps with? And I think both of those pieces are incredibly important.
Thanks. Michelle, I want to come back to, the previous point, which is that even who works at these companies, like that's something that you're working on. Are you able to share any anecdotes, stories of experiences people have had from within these companies? Because, I mean, one of the really amazing things is that it has taken so much employee activism to show the world what's going on. And that's such a critical piece in our current understanding of what's happening inside.
Yes, I mean, what we've learned is that there's been so many gatekeepers in this industry, and they haven't really gone outside of that traditional framework of recruiting from your MITs, your Georgia Techs, and even your employer referral system. I think a lot of companies are seeing even the divisiveness in that you're just recruiting or recommending your friends, and you're getting the same type of person in this role over and over again, so you're not getting that diversity that you're looking for. So venturing out of that, going to your boot camp and seeing, do I have someone who's better suited, someone that I can train from the beginning, and then go through their progression of their career, which also in turn creates loyalty from my company, because the person is going to stay with me longer than going around stifling through different companies, because I've trained them and even helped in their education. So we have seen that. We've had individuals who've come in, they've learned to code on their own from YouTube. And you saw that they have the propensity to learn this information even on their own, but they just need someone to give them a foot in the door. So we have seen that. And then companies have said, we would have found this talent without this type of model, because we have been looking in these same places for so long, thinking that we're going to find what we're looking for, but we're just not, right? Nothing against the MIT or your Georgia Tech or your Columbia, but there's other community people that you can reach into that can do the work and looking for what you desire to have in your company. So we have a mentorship program. So we have those who are in the organization mentor those who are in the program. One that allows for the person to see, can I fit here? Is this culture really for me? Am I going to thrive here, not just survive? So I won't have that turnover and keep going to different companies. And then it gives the company time to see, is this person also a good fit for my company? Will they be lasting here? How can I help them? How can I be an advocate for them in the future? So as I progress, they can progress too. That really creates a symbiotic relationship between the employer and the employee. We found that makes for a better relationship for them to even last longer. To that point, we came in with Target this year. Their first time working with us, we did a cohort with 19 individuals, wanted them to be software engineers learning JavaScript. And we did that in 10 weeks, which is kind of unheard of, to teach people how to do JavaScript in 10 weeks when they have no formal education or any type of touch point to it before, but we made it possible. We had 13 placed in full-time roles, and 6 were given printerships. And because of that, Target has agreed to do additional cohorts with us this coming year. So they saw the importance of it and how robust the program was, that they really able to get the talent that they're looking for. People who are capable of doing the work, want to do the work, and are going to be dedicated to the company to be there long term, to even see the changes internally that they want to see, and not just even at the bigger picture. So that's some of the success stories. Even in salary increases, the average increase is $45,000 for someone entering the tech space. We had a gentleman, he was making $13 an hour as a waiter. Now he's a software engineer making $72,000. That's a huge jump where he was before. Now he's able to have a sustainable living wage and help create wealth for his family and future generations to come. So we see it in terms of both ways, how it creates diversity in what we building better products, and how it creates income and wealth for communities to not be subjugated to what we're seeing now with not being able to be at the table, have equity, and these jobs being taken over by AI, which that will come. The future of work by McKinsey did report that by 2030, I think 60% of the jobs that we see today will no longer exist. But to the other side of that, there are jobs being created by AI, but you have to be able to code in order to have those jobs. So we're also trying to get ahead of that by teaching people how to code so they can not be left out when we see that big shift take place.
And other companies, what level of transparency do the big tech platforms have in terms of their internal diversity, like by gender, ethnicity, pay grade, income pay gaps, etc.? Like, do you pressure them to make all of that public? How much transparency is there?
So to work with us, we do make that transparent. How many employees do they have that are of color, from underrepresented backgrounds? How many women do they have? And they are transparent with us. We realize that they may not have the numbers that they have looking for, but when they come to us, they're essentially saying, hey, we don't know what we're doing or we need help. Can you help us? And that admission alone to us lets us know that they're really committed to the work, and it's just not for the moment. But we do ask for that data beforehand. But a lot of companies that we work with, they don't have a big diverse population. And even our students know that, hey, I'm really setting the marker for this and could be bringing other people in with me. But we do ask for that. Some companies, I think in the beginning, are a little hesitant to release that, especially if it's a low number. But we're not here to out them out. We're really here to help them to create the future that they want and the diversity of the workforce that they look to see as well.
Thanks, Michelle. And just a reminder, Rosh, I think, Vince, you did mention this at the start, but please, to our listeners, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll be happy to ask the panel. Kamal, I want to come back to you to go back to the exercise that you mentioned, like a lot of the work that went into what does the future media ecosystem look like. What were some of the, principles that emerged? And I guess, as a philanthropist, what aspect of that work can they seriously invest in?
Well, one thing I wanted to, the three main categories were intervening in ways that mitigate bias. So speaking to what Michelle just talked about, we looked at double-blind coding tests for workforce entry, and the fact that, kind of women jumped above men when you did double-blind coding tests, where men were being hired more just from, traditional interview and resume-based hiring practices. We also saw a need to another major intervention was, how do we intervene in that group think? Like, even if we do get not just the diversity in terms of ethnic and racial or gender background, which already brings an incredible diversity of thought in with it, but also, like, I had a conversation with Robert Wong at the Google Creative Lab, and he was fearful that we would not be able to create human-centered designed futures because we are not having enough diversity of thought in terms of the types of people that are designing these systems. If they're just coming from the field of engineering only, they're not going to have, I spoke with Pascal Fung, who is a professor at University of Hong Kong and one of the AI engineer and robotics experts in China. And she said that my students are so in the details of making these systems work on a very granular level, they don't even have the capacity to do the kind of 30,000 foot understanding of the sociological and the kind of mental health and all of the other well-being issues that these systems we've seen have had negative impacts on. And so they need collaboration across those silos. So when I was working with, I've worked with, fortunately, with Hopkins and Stanford and NYU and MIT over the last few years, looking at these issues. And Stanford specifically said, we did a survey and realized that over 20 years, we did not prepare our students to graduate and to be good stewards of this technology because their education was very siloed and hyper specialized, and they didn't have the bandwidth to understand how these implications were going to impact people. So besides just the kind of capitalistic imperatives of creating addictive design on purpose to keep people addicted to the product, you also even have, even those with good intentions might have, kind of perceptual limitations because they're not in the right conversation. So as philanthropists, how are we funding those kinds of initiatives to break down those barriers of sight? And how are we funding those opportunities to make bias blind? And then on a bigger level, really, how are we thinking about those systems change policies? Are we how are we looking at journalistic standards very differently? How are we looking at creating space that is outside of those academic institutions that are the pipeline for these systems, to allow communities to have a voice and feel empowered to, like, we often feel prescribed by Silicon Valley what our social lives and our kind of functional lives are by these technologies. How do we get to participate in designing those systems? Is there ways we have the technology to democratize imagination of our future? That technology is used for advertising and big business to capture every detail of our lives, where they know things like whether you're pregnant before you do, because they're watching certain kind of data, search, way you're searching things, or the way that you're, geo-aware technology is tracking you, or whatever, what products you're buying. And I think that if we can do that for the purposes of, serving corporate bottom lines, we can do that to allow for more insight in how we want to use these technologies for the public space.
Eli, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, that piece of, I mean, this is part of where I think this metaphor of thinking about, well, what institutions have served these functions well in our not online life. It's not just that they aren't primarily, driven by VC economics, although that's certainly a piece. And a kind of joke that I often make is like, just try to imagine what a library looks like if it's set up as a VC-backed startup. Like, it loses all of the things that make it socially valuable. But I think it's also about governance and community participation, which is, I think, what Kamal was getting to. And again, that's really hard if what you're trying to do is build something that's going to give a 10x return and produce dividends for investors on a quarterly basis. But when you're trying to set up public institutions, this is something that we know something about. And so I think, to me, part of this is like, where are we looking for the solutions? And I think there's more that's known about the shape of what solutions might be in other disciplines, as Kamal is saying, than maybe inside sort of the narrow tech Silicon Valley world, where everyone's pitching their next photo sharing app. And so, I definitely think that cross-pollination is really important. And then I also think it's this question of vision and who gets to be having the vision, right? And that's why the futurist writing room work that's happening is so important. But how do we make sure that it's not a bunch of white bros that get to have the dreams of what the future looks like?
Let me take that white rose.
As a white bro myself.
I'm actually going to take that white rose question too, Michelle. Like, is there a recognition within the big tech companies when you talk to them that, like, the homogeneity is a problem?
Yes, we do. We have a relationship with Facebook, and we just did an event with their chief diversity officer. And yes, they will admit that is an issue, and they're looking to combat that. And they're just frank that there are so many jobs available that they need to fill. They're not going to fill all of them with the people that they have right now in the market. So they look to other people like us to help them. But I say self-regulation is not possible in this industry. There needs to be an outside commission to really hold them to the fire, because their main modus operandi is to make money and make money for their investors, not really for the public good. So when they recognize that, they do tend to lean outside of their scope and outside of their internal structures to have someone to help them with the issues that are at hand. So they need, someone like us, someone like Eli, Kamal, Vince to help them and to say, hey, you are not in alignment. Whether that should be a federal commission doing that or a nonprofit, I think that's really the key answer we have to address. Like, who is the entity to really hold them to the fire and make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and not preying upon the weak just to make a dollar. Because everything that you do right now, especially at a Facebook or Instagram, is yielding a return, down to the sense of you clicking on a picture, you liking it, you sharing it. So how do we come out of that mindset to really do tech for good and not just tech for monetary gain?
I want to go back to building the new infrastructure, the new digital public space, and ask you a broad question, which is, what are the biggest challenges to that? For example, when I think about the monopoly power of the big tech platforms, I guess we tend to think of the new public space as being an alternative to replacing, and then the monopoly power of the big tech platforms really hits you like a sucker punch. What are the biggest challenges? How should we think about it? Should we think about replacing? Should we think about slowly growing? How should we think about it? Eli, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually, there are probably more radical visions, but for me, I would be happy with, again, keying off the model of how we've solved these problems in other communities. Like, the fact that you have a community center or a library doesn't mean you get rid of the bookstore or the mall or whatever. It's like both of those things serve functions in a community, but there are a bunch of functions that are not going to be well served by a market economy. That's just a fact. And I actually think zooming in on what those functions are gives us this is work that I'm hoping to, be thinking about more in the next year. But, it feels like, okay, we could look very tangibly at what are those areas where we don't have, they're important public needs, but they're not likely to be solved by a market system, and start building there. And I think, one example that we have of how this might work is the relationship between a Google and a Wikipedia, where, Wikipedia solves a really important problem for Google, which is that Google could, come up with commission Google Encyclopedia and, be pushing people to Google's source of truth, but it wouldn't have the legitimacy and it wouldn't have the integrity that Wikipedia has, because it would ultimately, not be created in the same way. And so there's a kind of legitimacy that community institutions have that, and that you might replicate this with, for example, some kinds of community conversation. I could talk more about that, but I don't want to go on. But I think there are a bunch of places like that where you can start to see how it's not necessarily redoing Facebook as a public utility. It's finding these areas where Facebook's not ever going to do a good job, and where a public institution can, and starting to build there.
Thank you. That's fantastic. There's actually a question in the Q&A, which I think brings the sense of urgency back to the conversation. Republicans in Congress are refusing to recognize Biden's win. In thinking about the role of big tech in undermining democracy, what are the absolute must-dos for the next 4 years to prevent a catastrophic election in 2024? And how much can realistically be accomplished? Kamal, must-dos in the next 4 years?
Well, I think that we have to see greater regulation on, things that are just untrue, just blatantly untrue. I know that we now have, kind of some kind of like alarm bells or red flags that go on certain posts that this has not been, verified and all that stuff. But we've also seen a very stickiness of people to ignore what is a red flag. This is not true. And they still want to hold on to that as true. So, I mean, unfortunately, there's something more fundamental to that, which is not a rational, it's not a rational thing. It's more about building narratives between communities so that they can start to see past their own, the biases that are not new biases either. I mean, these are narratives. If you look back into the history of even American literature, you see, how Native Americans were looked at as savage until they were basically, put on all reservations and kind of quote unquote controlled. And then the Last Mohican and the ideas of the noble savage started to come out. So we do have a narrative issue that's much broader than just a single tweet or a single post that we need, that has a deeper education and a deeper kind of relational strategy that needs to be done. But I also think that there's a real importance. We have had media literacy kind of gain steam within our culture over the last 10 years or so, but we do not understand kind of truth literacy. I don't know how better to put it. I don't know, truth is a very subjective word, but we need to be able to educate our children. We need to educate ourselves on how do we find out what is true. And I think journalists and some of those standards, we're actually running we're going to be making a major focus on the future of journalism in 2021 to kind of uncover what are those things that need to get implemented in order to do that. So that's all. Yeah, that's the best answer I have at this point.
No, that's great. Eli, must-dos?
It's a really hard one. I mean, I honestly, I guess maybe surprising, but I don't think there are probably like in the next 4 years solutions to this particular challenge, because I think it runs deeper, and it's a trust. Fundamentally, this is about who do people trust and which institutions do people trust. And until you can reestablish trust in institutions that are doing the work that Kamal is talking about, it's really hard to, it's not just a matter of like turning down some facts and turning up others. It's a matter of how people feel connected to institutions and forces in society. And so that's is not to say that it's a fruitless project. It's incredibly important. I'm just saying, I don't think it's one that you tackle like, checking some content moderation goals off a list, as important as that work is, and like just buying us a little time. Sort of like, everything's a pandemic analogy now, but there's flattening the curve, and then there's like the vaccine. Those are two totally different projects. There's stuff that can be done to like flatten the disinformation curve, totally, but you don't get to the vaccine until you really change the kinds of relationships that people have with institutions.
Michelle, do you want to answer? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. That's definitely an arduous task, right? I think it also starts with the very difference in messaging that's even coming from our news outlets. And then people just don't see the same type of messaging that you would think they do. You have Democrats saying one, Republicans saying another, and it's kind of based on who you follow. So having, to Kamal's point, a greater scrutiny on identifying what's truth and what's not, which I think that was the first time we really saw like Twitter being active and putting that tagline there saying that this may not be true, just kind of surmising what they said is very important. But how do we even combat or get ahead of that? Because once it's out there, you have millions of people seeing it even before it's tagged. So once it's out there, people are prone to grab on that and use it as that is absolute truth. And even today, like what is truth is just even bigger concept, because we see so many variants of the truth is identifying what is absolute truth. So I think that we just have to really look and tackle like how do we even disseminate information across these platforms, and saying that people see that same message and not a version of the message, on leaning onto their own biases, I think is what we really need to see. And how do we tackle that it's really a hard question to answer, just to be honest with you.
Although the platforms did implement a host of policies where they essentially like tried to implement systems that dialed down sources that were clearly spreading inauthentic information, or information that was false, blatantly false. And that did seem to have some impact on the spread of the disinformation. But I take your point that what impact is it actually having at the human level? Is it actually changing people's minds when they see those labels, etc.? There's another question in the chat, which is Indian author Nilesh Mishra, who is actually a man, he argued against teaching coding in primary schools, and he felt that it was being done at the expense of more creative pursuits and disciplines. So the question is, how would you respond? Are creative and technical learning mutually exclusive? Michelle, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. I understand that, I understand to your point of human-centered design, you kind of take that away if you just so focused on the technical aspect of it. And there are some things being created where coding is not necessary. So I can see that being mutually exclusive, but the point is we don't want them to be mutually exclusive. We want them to be creative and technical at the same time. So I think it's important to teach both to students in primary schools and not one without the other, really help combat that. I am a proponent for teaching those to to code early, but just at a basic foundation, don't go into the depths of it, at such a young age, so they can be more creative and have that imagination of how do we create things that are better, and not just for the time. How do we create things that are teaching us at a human level, and not just for a more transactional level, but really preparing us to address needs that we have, or future needs that we may have. So I think we shouldn't stop teaching it, but we should incorporate technical and creative teaching at the same time.
Can I follow on that real quick? I ran a program that was for artists, technologists, and engineers and scientists at Sundance for 7 years. And one of the major exciting things, but also one of the major hiccups, was a lack of language that was shared between those disciplines. And so I think it is critical, even if you're going to be an artist or a scientist or be in a specific hyper-specialization field, that you do have the at least the cursory knowledge of the other field, so that you can find those points of collaboration and have at least the shared language in order to have a conversation. So I think there is something in that early education that can create more hybridized minds that can allow the free flow of ideas to happen much more effectively.
Eli, did you want to answer that one? I have another question.
Go for it. I think that was a great, I thought those answers were great.
Great. My question was, so the first of this webinar series, we had two filmmakers, Jeff Arlovsky, who made The Social Dilemma, and Shalini Kantaya, who made Coded Bias. I think a lot of people were introduced to the subject of algorithmic bias through this film, and The Social Dilemma has apparently been translated into 38 languages. So, more people are having a dinner table conversation about this stuff than ever before. And so, and both films were funded by philanthropists. How much work do we still need to do on the awareness raising side before we can, or maybe they're mutually exclusive, but how much work do we still need to do on the awareness raising side, as well as parallelly be funding initiatives that look to the future to create something bigger, brighter, bolder, more wonderful?
So, go ahead, go.
No, sorry, you please, Eli.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm friends with a lot of people who were part of Social Dilemma, and friends with a lot of people who hate Social Dilemma, and it's an interesting kind of message, story about where we are, I think, in this space, which is, on the one hand, I think folks who are in the world of tech reform can forget how, I think really people are not aware of some of the very basic dynamics that are at play. And while folks in that world go, well, this is a total misanalysis in this and this and this way, I think a lot of people come to that film and just go like, oh my God, the amount of power that comes with this data, I just didn't really get that. And so on the one hand, I do think, there's this phrase someone once told me, which is, the point at which you're sick of your message is the point at which people are just starting to hear it. And like, I think we can never overassume that people really even have gotten the very basic dynamics that are work at the sector. There is a lot of important work to do there. And I think the critique of Social Dilemma is, we're still centering this very Silicon Valley way of thinking about and talking about these problems, and frankly, a bunch of white engineers who feel a little sorry for what they did. And so, we're not yet kind of broadening the aperture to talk about both what kinds of solutions are possible and the different kinds of communities that might be part of those solutions. And so until we do that, we're going to have this very kind of reactive conversation that may not push things forward. So I really think there's an enormous need for both. And I think, I'm inspired by, a whole history of movements for public innovation that have come at many times of kind of societal strife and struggle that include, storytelling aspects, if it's, life and death of American cities, or if it's something much more visceral, but and kind of vision, and then also, a really strong critique. And you really need both of those things in order to create the kind of change on the scale that I think we need to. But that piece, I just think we should never imagine that most folks have fully grokked, what all is going on yet, and that's really important work to do.
Kamal, I'm going to actually, before you speak, add a follow-up and actually make that a closing question, which is that, let's say, what are the top 3 things that philanthropists should do or could fund as they think about the reform of the digital public square?
Well, just really quickly, I wanted to say, provide the dam analogy that, right now we have a dam that's breaking, the infrastructure is antiquated, we have cracks, we have water, we have a town in the pathway of the water that could get flooded, and everybody's trying to solve the infrastructure issues of this antiquated system. And, but how are we spending resources? We need to spend those resources because there's lives at stake, but we also need to spend those resources and figuring out what is a new relationship to this tributary completely in terms of human relationships with that nature. So I think part of what I've seen in my own eyes and what I've seen from certain analyses is that part of what continues to put philanthropists and social activists into this crisis to crisis mode of resourcing, which is minimal compared to what, like you look at food systems alone, you got, little bits of money that are going to the future of food systems, and you got billions of dollars being spent on bad food systems. So I'm just like, the amount of money that philanthropy is giving is nowhere near enough to mitigate those, just to mitigate the fractures in the old system. We have got to invest in whole new designs. And just quickly, we had I won't give you all the details, but we did have a conversation with an institution that was going through a lot of critique around being decolonized, who had $1 billion in power. And after we did a speculative narrative about the future of their industry that is decolonized, they told us, oh, now my fear was just we decolonize and there's a void. Now we have a sense of, if we decolonize this, there's this abundance on the other side. And I think that's part of what we need to invest in, is foresight for marginalized communities that are always operating in crisis to crisis. And so I think it's a social justice issue to invest in strategic foresight.
Sorry, kids in the background. Michelle, and I'll come to you for the closing comments. Eli, Michelle, to you.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with Kamal. Definitely investing in awareness. Just going back to your point on the social dilemma. I think if people really understood the basic concept, what it is, we would have a far bigger public outcry and outrage of what's going on. The fact that we don't have that just shows that people really don't understand what's at play and how we are just being played with our human emotions just to be on these apps. So I think if they really understood that, there would be an outcry and demand for these big tech companies, or just the tech industry at all, to change how they're operating right now. So bringing awareness, we can invest in storytelling. Storytelling is powerful in how we even see what's going on in the world, and what issues are at play, and what even resources and liberties that we have that will be at play and taken from us in the future. So definitely investing in that. And for investing in infrastructure to have broadband access, there's a whole population that's going to be left behind because they don't have access to information, because they don't have internet or sustainable quality internet. So investing in an infrastructure being created is direly important. There's been lots of companies that have come under a fire because they don't invest in companies deemed as not being profitable. Well, this is something that's not just profitable. It's not a luxury to have internet now. Now it's a necessity. Just like you need water, you need food, you need lights, so on and so forth. You need internet, because that's how most people get their information. It's not through your newspaper. It's not through a magazine. It's through your phone now. And unfortunately, Instagram has become, or Twitter has become, the news source for so many people. So we have to invest in that. And just investing in talent, diversity of mind is critically important, to Kamal's point, not just in gender, ethnicity, but in the disciplines that you're coming from, is really going to help us build better things, create better things for the future. So we all have a fighting chance to live in a fair economy, an equitable economy that we want to see, and just direly important.
Thank you. And Eli?
Agree with all of that. And don't hold me to this, but since I like alliteration, I'm going to go with 3 E's. All right. So new entrepreneurs, new experiments, and new ecosystem. So entrepreneurs, we need, different folks at the table. This is partly, the work that Michelle is doing, and is partly kind of the vision work who feels entitled to kind of be the Elon Musk for public digital space or whatever. It shouldn't be Elon. I think the experiments, we're at this frothy kind of like Cambrian moment, and starting to just have these little projects that can show what a new future might look like on a really, tangible scale and on a small scale is going to be really important. And we're starting to see those. We'll showcase that. We have a showcase of a few of them at the festival next week, but we need a lot more. And that's where I think we'll find a lot of these solutions. And then I think the ecosystem is also really this important piece because, Silicon Valley isn't just a kind of funding stream, it's also a cultural milieu, it's a set of values. And all of that kind of reinforces a certain way of looking at the world. And I think if we want something different, we're going to really have to think about how to create that whole type of ecosystem. I look at groups like Zebras Unite as one example of folks who are doing work to rethink what a successful kind of startup looks like and acts like. But there are a lot of, I think we really need to be thinking about that as well. So entrepreneurs, experiments, ecosystem, but don't hold me to that because I just came up with that.
Thank you. Well, the good thing about alliterations is that they're sticky and we will remember them. And it came from Eli, also starts with an E.
I know, I feel bad.
Thank you all so much for this scintillating conversation. And Vince, back to you.
Thank you, Alafia. Thank you, all of our speakers today, for their inspiring work and provocative ideas, Michelle, Kamal, and Eli. And thank you for your masterful moderation. If I can alliterate a little bit, Alafia, really, I could listen to you leading a conversation for hours. So thank you once again for that. I will just acknowledge that the jumping off point for these conversations, with the films of Social Dilemma and Coded Bias, began at last year's Sundance. And Sundance is coming back in its reconceived virtual fashion. We're going to have our annual Sundance kickoff gathering on January 27th. People should join us for that. We'll hear, I'm sure it'll be the jumping off point of another interesting conversation. So stay tuned for more information about that. And we're going to come back for the third part of this series next month. Stay tuned also for an announcement of the date, time, and specific topics. But we're going to build on this and talk about institutions and organizations that have built some of these solutions at scale, like Wikipedia and Mozilla and others. And we've got some great ideas to share about that as well. So we look forward to our next conversation as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.